Not for me.
Well, here we go. We are live, everyone. If you open your Bibles, the text of James chapter 5, we'll get to there in just a second. We've got a really great study planned. I use planned in the really loose sense of planning at this point.
Because we're easily distracted, let's be honest.
Everyone's caged up. We're a bunch of squirrels looking for whatever can
No, we're a bunch of
entertain us.
dogs looking for squirrels right now. That's what we are.
If you got your Bibles open, we're going to read in just a second. Before we do that, we've got Michael Walls and Hal Hammonds joining us. Hal, this is your first time on this study and on Do the Work. I know that probably you're one of the couple guys who have watched more of it live than anybody else. So here's your chance to make
president of the Do the Work fan club. Hal Hammonds is
commenting boss for sure.
Long-term commenter, first time actual show appearance.
Yeah.
And I want to know why you couldn't have gone one verse farther. You know, you have to stop before verse 12. And then you invite me on. That's how you treat your best fan. I don't appreciate that.
Because we had heard you were an expert on verse 12. So when we get there, we're letting you just explain all of it, and we're going to listen. That's the plan.
Is that right? Okay.
Yep.
So,
by the way, do want to plug Hal's got a podcast, really great. I've been on it. Citizens of Heaven. He does some kind of fun stuff with that, kind of neat stuff. If you've not listened, you should listen to that. It's good stuff.
It is.
Thank you very much.
And at the end, when we go around the horn, we'll have another chance to plug that. Brother Walls, how are you doing?
I'm great. How are you all?
Well, good. I'm good here. Good to see you in your upgraded library there right behind you. It's an excellent
It's looking
addition.
good.
Yeah, maybe a few books can move around. Maybe the next time we have you on, we'll see some additions to the library.
Next time.
Is that 4 copies of Vines? I mean, come on. Who needs 4 copies of
I don't
Strongs?
actually know what these are.
He's got
I
4
can't
Vines
read
and
the
3
titles.
strong concordances back there.
I've been wondering if the titles are even in English.
All right, we got to stay focused because one of my friends who watches the studies over in the Lilburn area mentioned that we're having too much fun and maybe we're not getting through the text in the clearest way possible. So we got to have some level of work.
Wait
Who was
a
that?
minute.
I will not reveal their name. They are super sweet, and I appreciate them greatly.
We love you, but this may not be the podcast for you.
Hey, Hal, let's help us out. Let's read just verse 12 right now.
Verse 12.
Just verse 12. No
But above
ambitious
all, my
goals.
brothers, do not swear, either by heaven or by earth, or by any other oath, but let your yes be yes and your no be no, so that you may not fall under condemnation.
All right, so that's not an ambitious goal right here. Verse 12, we can focus in, we can make some good comments, we can move forward after that. So at least as a couple of quick reminders, some of the things we've noted in the text of James are really important. James is a great text to read side by side with the Sermon on the Mount. It's a great text to read side by side with any of the broader teaching of Jesus. And as we've noted before, many of the things that James uses as either illustrations or explanations are very similar to the teaching style of Jesus and the context of the Galilean area, north of Israel. He uses illustrations that kind of fit that setting and situation. So right here, verse 12 is a really easy one. Does this seem similar to anything in the Sermon on the Mount and similar to the teaching of Jesus for either of you guys that are joining us or for Terry? Like, what do we got here?
Sure, Matthew 5, right?
Oh, yeah.
Basically the same exact thing.
This is low-hanging fruit on the comparison scale.
Yeah, and I'll take it. I'm grabbing it. It drew me, though, as I was thinking about this, over to Matthew 23, where Jesus is hammering on the Pharisees, right? Verse 16, woe to you blind guides. If anyone swears by the temple, it's nothing. But if anyone swears by the gold of the temple, he's bound by his oath. And that's where I go with this passage, that's the abuse. That's the problem. I may be going out on a limb here, but that those guys were taking it to some level that was absurd and wrong. And of course, that's what Jesus is getting them for. I feel like James is in the same space.
Yeah.
it's the Jewish form of crossing your fingers, right?
Yeah,
I mean, that's
exactly.
kind of that's kind of what it becomes. And
Yeah.
I think we were kind of joking beforehand about verse 12 being difficult. I don't think it's all that difficult. I think maybe I'm oversimplistic, but it just seems Jesus and James are both saying, hey, if you always tell the truth, none of this is a problem. Like, I don't, and that's one of the things we teach our kids, right? Just be an honest kid, be an honest person. If you do that, you don't have to make promises. You don't have to swear. You don't have to make oaths. And I'm going to look, I'll say this too, let the Facebook comments come. I don't think this has to do with taking an oath in a court of law. I think that's a completely different arena.
Agree.
That's an affirmation you will tell the truth under a certain circumstance. And that is not something that is dictated because you're known to be a dishonest person. This is about somebody who is known to be dishonest, and you only trust them when they say things like, no, I swear to you. And that's a problem, And it's like the joke when somebody goes, well, let me be honest with you. And you go, well, I'd like you to do that all the time, kind of thing, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's what this is talking about. Again, I just don't think it's that hard. I think one of the things we do is misapply this to things like an oath in a court of law.
Yeah, how?
Well, there's a broader context from the Old Testament, of course, where oath taking, the Nazarite vow is the most obvious one. There's the Rechabites in Jeremiah, where people feel compelled for whatever reason to amplify their connection to God or to God's word or to the particular situation there. And an oath was attached to that. And clearly God authorized that. There's nothing wrong with that. I think maybe, as is the case in a lot of situations in New Testament times, Old Testament principles have morphed and become something that they were never intended to be, some kind of test of fellowship. I'm a better Jew, I'm a better follower of God because I take oaths or whatever. And then from that, you get the people who take, well, this oath is better than that oath. And maybe if I take this oath, I'm an oath taker, but it doesn't really bind me like this other oath might. So I can still kind of do whatever I want, but I'm still one of this elite crew that takes oaths.
Yeah, there's something interesting to pay attention to as like a teaching moment here. In Matthew 5:37, the text that's in the King James renders it, but let your speech be yea, yea, aye, nay, whatever is more than these is the evil one. That speech there is logos. And the teaching moment here is to pay attention that words in the New Testament get used in both common and uncommon ways. Because in John 1:1, the same thing is used concerning the Christ. And so this ties into the context here because we see oath and we immediately hop and go, okay, that's got to be formal, structured. It's in a court of law. It's in the structure of those big assemblies. And so it only applies then. Or when we rise to then that level of seriousness, then we can't take an oath because God says not to take. It's not about any of those things. Just like how logos can refer to and does refer to Jesus incarnate, God made flesh, but it also reads just your speech, just the things we say back and forth. And so I think there's a powerful dual level teaching moment there if we let it be that, look, just as much as those two things are true, so it can be true for the ecclesia. It can be an angry mob, or it can be the church together. It can be for evil behaviors, evil motives. All these words have a stretchier, more elastic meaning that Jesus uses sometimes to teach things. Sometimes he's hinting at stuff because he pulls a word that stretches more. And I think in this immediate context, Hal's really right to pull in the Old Testament struggles that the Jews had created. And I say Jews really accommodative. The really narrowly focused Pharisees, Sadducees, the Sanhedrin, the leading context, even some of the priests had really created a structure that had a few get out of jail cards. They basically built hedges to not protect them from sin, but to protect them from doing what God wanted them to do. Their hedge is really kind of hedged in the law rather than hedged out rebellion. And I think there's some good there too.
And they had semantically compartmentalized all of these oaths so much that if you say this, it doesn't count. If you say that, it does count. And Jesus in Matthew 5 says anything you say before the Lord counts. I mean, that's
Yeah.
I mean, again, that's the ultimate lesson here is, right? I'll compare that to an oath. I think that some people try to do the same thing with is I've seen people in the regards to the vow or oath of marriage they take that later on they get down the road and they go, well, this happened or this happened. It didn't really count. And it's like, no, God was there for that. That counts. Like and people argue. To me, it's very similar. People argue, well, God didn't recognize that vow I made. No, he really did. It doesn't matter the qualifications and all that kind of stuff. God sees all of that.
Yeah.
And I just think there's a lot of applications in that way. And I might have treaded into waters we don't want to go into, but I think
the water
there's
looks
some
fine over there in the
expansion
deep end, just fine.
There's a lot of lessons. There's this classic loophole thinking, right? How do I get out of my responsibility? As you said, rebellion, right? How do I not about rebellion? It's about me. And unfortunately, a lot of believers today think that way. How do I loophole this particular commandment or situation?
Yeah.
Sin.
By the way, first time Phil ever mentioned deep waters and me in the same sentence. Let's be honest. Anyway, how
the whole I'll marry this one for better or for worse as long as it's better. That's the analogy that I usually use. It's very similar to what Jesus says in Matthew 12 about the careless words that we speak, verse 36, 37. We're going to be judged by these things. The things that come out of our mouth matter. And it's easy to convince ourselves, well, I was just joking, or I had a bad day, or I didn't really think that through. And in the age of social media, this has never been more relevant than it is now, because it's so easy to put things out there into the world and not hold ourselves accountable and just say, well, I didn't really mean that, and act like it never happened, which is just crazy and really destructive.
Yeah,
for sure.
Yeah, and as we kind of move forward in the text, we'll scoot forward now. I think that's.
Let me explain one time. I mentioned now in the earlier talk about why I thought this was such an annoying passage for me. The thing that bugs me is the way that James introduces the verse. He says, but above all, this is a passage that's fraught with urgent contexts. The receiving a sinful person back and recognizing your enemies, and that it seems an odd thing for James to draw a big red circle around. Like this is more urgent than anything else in the passage. And I was just reading, and Lenski was saying that this is more just of a get this thing first squared away, rather than this is more important than anything else, which I thought maybe might be an interesting thing. If we can't be counted on to be people of our word, then what's the point of any of this? If you are not yet to the point where people, your brethren especially, can look at you and assume that you're telling the truth, then we're not really going to make any progress on any other front with regard to spiritual things.
Well, and I think you could tie this to James 3, right? That James 3 talks about, hey, here's this one thing that everybody struggles with. Here's this one thing we have in common, which is our tongue. And I think a little bit there's a connection to that as well, that above all, hey, look, almost a reminder, this is one specific area of the tongue. Can't overlook that as well. And I've looked at some of those statements of above all, come now. I remember when I was a kid, Ward Hoagland held a meeting for us when I was growing up in Tennessee, and he would stop in the middle of the sermon and he would say, are you listening to me? Like just at random points, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think sometimes some of these things that James does is almost like grabbing you by the throat and going, no, wake up. You got to hear this too, right? So I wonder if the above all, I obviously know that does mean that, hey, this is really important. But like even the come now, it's kind of like he's slapping them on the face and go, no, pay attention again, right? And you just see those kind of phrases sprinkled throughout James, kind of like attention getters. I find that interesting, that he's highlighting. And if you really try to categorize which one's more important, you'd have a real difficult time, I think, just lining all of those up. Oh, this is the number one, because he just does that so much throughout here.
Jesus does it too, right? He who has ears to hear, let him hear. I mean, we all do it.
Sure.
Hey, look, Shane, I just tried to pull us forward. Shane's commenting that we're just trying to stall, so we didn't get to 14 and 15. And Hal's the one who tried to stall. But
hey,
Chris
we're doing a really good job. See you tomorrow, Shane.
Yeah. Chris has a question that I wanted to bring in because I think it is important and it helps us understand the bridge. Hal talked about verse 12 being kind of an introduction or a tag. I think it's a continuing bridge. These are bridge statements because chapters, divisions, all that stuff really is more of our ability to grapple with the text rather than figuring out what's important in the way in which these letters are put together. So his question is this about relationships with people wherein a verbal commitment is needed, or is it about connection to God, in which case even more mental commitments are included? And I'll give you my answer because it's based on the parallel reading of James and the Sermon on the Mount. This is a kingdom letter. And so this is about behavior in the kingdom. And this is a kingdom letter, your behavior in the kingdom when your earthly world gets shattered. And so these Christians who are from primarily Jerusalem are being sent out into the world, and James is reminding them what their king told them before they go forth. So it's going to have actually, which is a standard line of mine, can we have both? So in the kingdom...
The answer is yes.
Yeah. In the kingdom relationship to God, your commitment then is seen in the fruit of your personal commitments to one another, conversationally or relationship-wise, marital, better or worse, all of that. And so it's encompassed in all those edges as I read the text.
Well,
Around the other edge of the horn, too.
I think one of the things, Phil, about that too is we seem to try to compartmentalize everything. Like, is it this or is it that? Yeah, it's both. I mean, I think what this is about is not whether this is about a relationship with man or a relationship with God, and whether it's verbal, whether it's mental. It's about honesty, which is just a characteristic of mankind that you're supposed to have as a disciple. And if you have that in your heart, because so much of the Sermon on the Mount and James is about getting the heart right, if you have that, then in both of those situations, Chris explains, it's all taken care of. Right. And so rather than, and I'm not criticizing Chris from this standpoint, I'm just saying I think sometimes we could be a little bit like the Pharisees trying to go, okay, which one does this apply to? All of it. This is about making sure that you're just a person who, in your commitments to God and your commitments to man, you're known to keep all of them. All of them. And I just don't think you can separate the two.
Yeah, one leads to the other, though, right? That's another common theme.
Right.
So Casey's got a question. I'll bring it in real quick to Chris also. Please note that Terry is the one referred to potentially criticizing Chris. I hassle Chris incessantly about his...
I did a disclaimer. I said I'm not criticizing Chris.
I'll criticize Chris.
We love you, Chris.
I know better than take on Ken of the church. I mean, Ken and Barbie. I know better than that. So
that's good.
Pretty.
That's rich. So Casey Gray first. He points us to Matthew 23, verses 16 and 22, and he talks about the Jews trying to swear by the certain parts of the temple in that context. Would you say oaths are fine, but they must be used sparingly? Oaths in marriage courts, especially to the Lord, must be taken very seriously. That's a more and broad, complicated text question. So let's answer that before we talk about Dominic's comment, which is follow on to Shane's comment here in a second. So
anything to delay getting to verse 14 and 15 today to make
asking questions, I'm going to answer them.
I thought we basically established that point, though, right? That this is about honesty, and this is not about some legal issue where you stand before a judge or a court, and that basically signs you up legally for perjury or not, right? And this is just about being honest. This is just about being who you are. And Terry made the point about the or maybe it was Hal, about the marriage oath. I mean, these are, it may not be put in those terms, but that is what it is.
Yeah.
When you're baptized, it's the same thing too. You're basically, you're confessing your faith and saying, I am now aligning myself with God.
Anybody I preach to knows how obsessive I am about not but phrases, and this is another one of those not but phrases. A little bit tougher to find than Matthew 6 or John 6:27, for instance. That don't work for the food that perishes, but for the food that endures. The idea is that you're emphasizing one thing by de-emphasizing this other thing. It's not that the thing that you're de-emphasizing is wrong in and of itself. It may or may not be, depending on the context. But we put so much emphasis over here. Well, we really ought to be talking about this over here. I think that this is a good example of that.
Yeah. Another way to quickly illustrate this is just think about this. You lie in court, you are accountable both to the court and Jehovah. You lie outside of the court, you're accountable to Jehovah. That's literally the difference between all of these things. And the consequences shift based on the court you're being judged by. Jesus actually uses that illustration in his teaching too. That's my approach to it. And I think that's probably an easy way for me to grapple with complicated things sometimes, is just to simplify it to my, here it is. This is what it is kind of level. Dominic, I'm going to answer your question real quickly. If I can possibly accomplish making you intentionally bring us some of your good insights, then I will do that. And so that's my answer to your question. So moving forward in theory into verse 13, let's go ahead and at least read all the way to say verse 18 right now. Michael, do you want to read that for us, verses 13
Sure.
through 18?
Sure. If anyone among you suffering, let him pray. Is anyone cheerful? Let him sing praise. Is anyone among you sick? Let him call for the elders of the church, and let them pray over him, anointing him with oil in the name of the Lord. And the prayer of faith will save the one who was sick, and the Lord will raise him up. And if he has committed sins, he will be forgiven. Therefore, confess your sins to one another and pray for one another, that you may be healed. The prayer of a righteous person has great power as it is working. Elijah was a man with a nature like ours, and he prayed fervently that it might not rain. And for 3 years and 6 months it did not rain on the earth. Then he prayed again, and heaven gave rain, and the earth bore its fruit.
All right, so a couple different renderings of the text are available to us. We've got the ESV that we're reading from today. Some different translations, because of the word usage, kind of emphasize different things. I'm thinking about the New American Standard, the New King James, two pretty good translations with a little bit of textual variance there. But for right now, let's pay attention to verses, say, 13 through 15 as our immediate context, although I will tell you, verses 16 through 18 are the answers to the questions of struggle for a lot of folks in this first part of the text. Whereas Walto points, I think I got 2 points today. That's a 2-pointer right there. Verse 13.
Double.
Is anyone among you suffering? Let him pray. Is anyone cheerful? Let him sing praise. Context, where's he going? This is the conclusion after the high peak of his letter in some ways. It gets to the close here, verse 19, but what do you guys see here in this 3-verse chunk or so? What's important for us to pay attention to? Textual insights, practical application. Everyone's really quiet.
Go ahead, Al.
Hal, it's all you.
Me.
I prefer to wait for Shane and Dominic myself, but we'll go ahead and.
I'm looking at this whole section, really chapter 5, and really James in general, but especially chapter 5, as a study in good guys and bad guys. And so much of the Bible breaks up into this. We need to know who's on our side and who's not on our side. And as you get especially into a verse number 14, where we're calling for the elders of the church, and I'm sure we'll get into that more specifically later on. But you have people who are on your side, and that's why you need to be honest with them. We're just talking about not gossiping about them, not complaining about them. You need to identify the people who are actually fighting against you that you talked about in the first few verses. These are not assets to you in your kingdom search. These are people who are hindering you. You need to not value the things they offer. There's a real problem, a real disconnect, I think, with regard to how we perceived in spiritual ways. He mentions in verse 13 this internal thing. If you take care of yourself first. If I need to pray if I'm in trouble. If that doesn't work, I need to seek somebody else out to help me pray. Somebody who is on my side. If I'm rejoicing, I need to sing praises. Well, is there another step beyond that? Well, of course there is. You can sing with the group. You can sing with the community. There's ways to be God's person and then be one of God's people and strive toward spiritual things in that way.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. This is as Phil said, keep it simple, right? This is the answer. And he's already talked a little bit about it. If you're suffering, what do people do? They start complaining. They start going off the deep end. They say, well, things are bad, so I'm just going to go dive into some sort of downward spiral of passion or sin or self-indulgence. No, pray, right? You're happy. sometimes people do the same thing. They celebrate, right? They get drunk. They do all this. No, sing praise. Are you sick? Have someone pray with you. In this case, specifically the elders. I mean, it's not rocket science here, is it?
Well, we can make
I see.
it, but there's.
So I think a lot about the psalmist in this verse. That recently did a study about the Psalms, and the psalmist, the people who wrote the Psalms, their response is the same whether it's good times or bad. They turn to God, and that's really what we have here. Is if you're sick, if you're suffering, if you're struggling, go to God. If you're happy, if you've been blessed, go to God. And I think that's one of the things that's really interesting is, and we're not trained that way, but that seems to be the idea here. I'm going to go down another rabbit hole, and partly to avoid the oil. That will be for tomorrow. But I think one of the things that I see in this passage,
not my plan,
kind of a sidestep, is just the role of elders. And I'm going to be highly critical for a moment. I think that the number of elderships who are operating in this fashion is smaller than it should be. And what I mean by that is there has been a trend in my lifetime, and we've talked about this before, and there's a lot of work going on about that elderships today, and I think there's some reasons for this. I think you can trace this back to the war, and that when people came out of the war, everything was rank and order. And then that's been compounded by the business world where everything is employer-employee, that elders are seen more as managers and administrators over the church rather than shepherds. And if elders were acting as shepherds more, the sheep would have no problem calling the elders in times of need and asking them. But elders are normally seen as administrators and disciplinarians. They handle the funds, and they only get involved with people when there's problems. And the problem is, and by the way, I think what happens is in churches today, at least my experience, I don't know about y'all's experience, but when somebody's sick and they need something, they don't call the elders, they call the preacher in our society. And that's a problem, because scripturally, what we see here is it's those shepherds. And this falls right along, by the way, with 1 Peter 5. And that idea of the shepherds shepherding the flock among them and taking care of their needs. And you apply that to Psalm 23, the idea of all that a shepherd would provide. So I just think one of the things to point out from this is that if the elders at the congregation you're at are not the first people you call when you're in need, then we have a problem in the way we're eldering today. It's not the relationship that should be existing in the church today. And I just think that needs to be pointed out. And I wasted 2 minutes, and y'all can comment, and we'll get to 10:30, and we'll deal with oil till tomorrow with Dominic and Shane.
Hal, what you got? You disagreeing right there? Is that a thumbs
No,
up?
No, I'm thumbs upping.
He's thumbing.
I totally agree.
Yeah.
That was a great point, and that's been my experience too. Not where I am now. It's actually been very. I mean, not perfectly, of course, but different. This our group's not been one to totally direct all their attention on the preacher. Of course, that's me. I'm also an elder now, but you're right. I mean, everyone wants to call the minister, the preacher, whoever, and the elders just kind of sit back, and that's not getting the job done, whether you're using the oil of anointment or not.
Yeah.
So I'll add a couple of quick things that I think are really important. Apparently, you guys have forced me to constantly go back. I've been trying to push the text forward, and I want that to be on record.
Let's do it.
But I'm going to answer a couple of questions.
Let's
too.
go.
I'll answer questions. There's plenty of text left for Dominic and Shane to stress about too. So one of the questions I want to answer came from Trey Haskett. How do you change the culture? There are two answers to that question that I can give quickly. Leaders have to lead. If you are shepherding a local church, I want to encourage you to listen to some videos by Max Dawson and Don Truax. Great conversation. I've been told that the conversation that Max and I had is a good place to start too. I will not say that it is near the quality of the one between Don and Max. Terry and I talked about it in earlier episodes of this broadcast. So learn to lead and reach further than your work experience to lead, go actually meet with the flock and learn to shepherd them. Go to their homes before there's a problem. Go spend time with them doing non-spiritual things, and learn the sheep. There's some books we'll try to recommend as well. We could probably drop those in the comments. But that's like the first part of it. The second part of that is to, if you're part of the flock, expect the sheep or the shepherds to actually do that job, to actually shepherd. And I'll be a little mercenary here this way. If you're not being shepherded, ask them to learn to do it, or find shepherds who will do it. That's the only thing I can tell you on the short run. Long run.
Well, I mean, one of the things to do with that, Phil, is start calling your elders instead of the preacher. I mean, part of that problem is the sheep.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's the deal.
Yeah. Preacher's got to preach. And so
elders and the preacher need to have that conversation too. I mean, and again, in some of our cases, that may be the same person, but in many cases, that's not. And they need to have that conversation and then expose that to the rest of the flock, the sheep, as you say.
Yeah.
I will say this also along those lines, without getting too bogged down in this. I'm sure there are some congregations, some members who are listening in, 20-member, 40-member congregations, no elders, who are saying, that sounds like a great plan. I would love to do that. And maybe in 40 years, we'll be doing that. No matter what kind of situation you're in, you do the best you can with what you have. You don't give up on God's plan until it becomes convenient to do God's plan. If you can't have men assign the specific task of shepherding, well, you figure out some other way to get the flock shepherded. You do what you have to do along the way toward God's plan, of course, always. But don't say, just throw up our hands and say, well, woe is us. We're not going to be able to make this work.
Yeah.
Well, it's the old hiring a preacher. He's a hired gun. He comes in and he does all this stuff. Nobody else necessarily does much. And that's wrong. We're all involved, whether we're shepherds, deacons, or sheep. We all have responsibility here.
So I'm going to answer Chris's question, and then I think time-wise we can kind of begin to go around the horn, close things off, and do that as best I can. So Chris asks, is sick physical, spiritual, or both? And the answer is the word that's used there applies in the context of both. It's an elastic Greek word that's used both and maybe primarily in some parts of the New Testament to talk about faithful or weakness in faith, weakness in doubt, unsettled, but it also has some usage on the physical side. Contextually in James is the only way we're going to figure out how James is using it. And James's use makes it difficult for us too, because James talks about physical stress, but his teaching is spiritual strain. It's all about the present distress of them being pushed from their comfort environment into a spiritual challenging one that's made challenging because of the physical stuff. So partially both, but my answer to it leans heavily into this is a spiritual context. This is faith. This is commitment. And so that answers a lot of the next order questions. Because it's Greek,
I think
it's elastic. And so don't box it into one word answer.
I'm not so sure this is one of those places where the physical is used as the transition to the spiritual, and the idea that physical sickness, that's one thing. But when you get to this part of verse 15 and then verse 16, it is obvious this is heavily spiritual, that this is really focused on the idea of sins and the idea of spiritual illness. Which, again, to go back to what I said earlier, and great question, Chris, I think, again, this is one of those deals where when people are spiritually sick, who do they call? They call the preacher. And let me give you another example of that. When people are spiritually sick and we extend an invitation, it's usually the preacher that handles all of that if somebody comes forward and they're an existing sheep of the flock. One of the things we started trying to do years ago where I was at was, hey, as elders, you should be down there if somebody comes forward. You should be, because there's a great value to elders responding to that spiritual sickness being confessed at that moment. Even the visual of the elders taking that confession and handling that is a tremendous tremendous thing for the church to see. But I think all of that, I think it heavily spiritual, especially as you kind of progress through this section.
Well,
Without getting too sidetracked, let me disagree with Terry a little bit here. I hope very much that his experience is different from mine. In my experience, when people are spiritually sick, they call nobody. They sit back, and they may not even talk to their wife or their husband about it. And they're certainly not going to talk to the elders or the preacher about it.
We preface it by if they talk to somebody.
Okay. But on a serious note, we've got to, and not to steal from the future here, but we've got to cultivate this culture where we depend on each other, where we confess our sins to one another, where we are actually a community that is greater than the sum of its parts. If we continue to be individual Christians who happen to be in the same building every week or so, unless there's a COVID virus breakout, in which case we're not even in the same building every once in a while. Until we come together as a body, we're swimming upstream.
Agreed.
All right, so
this was brought up before. Sorry, Phil. That in verse 12, the question was asked: is this God or man? We said it's both. What does it matter? Why would that be any different here? What does it matter? Who should you be calling? Obviously, if you're sick, you have the doctors, you have those trained professionals, as Terry likes to say. And but why wouldn't you call your elders? Why wouldn't you have that conversation? Why wouldn't you have them praying for you? And certainly in the spiritual context, who else would you want if you have that luxury? Hal said, but who else would it be? I mean, you still want to involve brothers and sisters when you can, but the elders are there for that purpose.
Can we go around the horn now? Because Michael's used to interrupting me and straightening me out. So that's like a long-standing tradition.
40-something years, man.
40-something.
We'll leave it at that.
Yeah. Hal, what you got for us today? Any last comments, things that you've got in the works that you want folks to know about?
Just trying to keep everybody healthy, praying for everybody, trying to stay out of harm's way. And let's. I'm sure that this bush has been beaten a lot lately, but maybe on the social media front, instead of blaming one group for meeting or blaming some other group for not meeting, maybe we could just do the best we can where we are and trust that we're all brethren and that we're trying to work this thing out, and that none of us knows what we're doing. And we're trusting in God to see us through all this.
Sure.
Amen.
Walls, what you got?
Just again, thanks everybody. I posted or shared an article on Facebook earlier this morning before I came on, where our Texas governor is declaring that religious services are essential services. How great was that? And again, I hope and trust that all groups practicing would use wisdom and so on to maybe not meet right now. But how great is that? And I know others are doing it. That kind of thing is still important, even in this really bad situation we're in.
Yeah, I'm sure Michael could give us a nice historical overview in another context of constitutional history in the United States. He might know something about that. Maybe. It's questionable.
A couple little things.
Yeah. Terry?
Not much. Just thanks for the conversation. Look forward to tomorrow with Dominic and Shane, and I'm sure that'll
Shane
be great.
Is tomorrow, and Dominic might be. I'm looking at my notes because I've got a couple.
Dominic was with Shane.
If that's the case, then that's
okay. Well,
more fun.
It's Shane tomorrow. That's all we have tomorrow. I just pulled up your notes. So looks like Shane tomorrow, and Shane, just study up on the oil, brother.
Yeah.
Looking forward to hearing it.
And thanks again, Terry, for the plug on the podcast and your participation in it. Gave him a chance to brag about Tennessee football last year, which was an interesting half an hour or so.
That doesn't happen often.
All right, so I've got a couple things I want to drop for today. Looking forward to the course of the week. Obviously, we've hinted that Shane Scott will be with us tomorrow, and we'll be looking at the text of James. Dominic will probably be here on Wednesday, where we'll summarize the rest of the book of James and kind of just tie all the pieces left together. So Dominic, that's what we're going to do.
We're going to plug Thursday, Phil.
Yes, we are. We're going to drop that right now. So Thursday, we're doing something a little bit different. Instead of having our normal preacher roundtable, we've got Peyton Francis, Jesse Martin, Levi Hawk, and Carson Crow, all college-age guys coming in to talk about one of the Bible texts. We're going to pick that here after we close the discussion. I've got a couple suggestions for us to think about. But Terry and I are going to be the moderators for that discussion. Let them kind of show the church of now rather than the church of future. And I think they're great guys. All of them will do a great job. Obviously, I'm biased.
Can I vote for Zechariah?
Yeah. We're going to have them deal with the life of David in 1st and 2nd Samuel and explain to us the differences in the timelines and the chronologies and why David is
Well, I
young,
thought
old, and young.
since my son's name is Pork Chop, we would have them talk about the cleanliness laws and how pork meat is unclean, and we could go through that as well.
I'm just blown away that you think you're actually going to get there by Thursday.
Well, they're scheduled, so whether we're there or not, we're skipping James Thursday. That's for sure.
Yeah. So they're on the schedule for that. That's going to be a fun time. Hopefully be uplifting and encouraging. Those guys are all funny as well. And so there's another bonus to think about. A few other things going forward for the future. I want to give one general admonition. If your default behavior can be kind, things will get a lot better. Choosing to be kind is a choice. And I think if we can accomplish that, we will, in all of these areas we've talked about, be far more comfortable, far less stressed. And I think we'll be able to kind of share the grace of God in a much more healthy way. As we've been doing, we want to encourage you to seek God. If you have questions about what God teaches through His Word and through His Son, drop us a message. And we hope that God blesses you in all that you seek to accomplish according to His will today. Thanks.